Hi, I'm Crichlow and welcome to the latest Aviation 2020 video interview. Joining me today is Gary Crichlow, our resident ETS expert and senior analyst. Gary, we spoke to you in June 2009 about the emissions trading scheme.
Yeah.
9 months have gone past. What major developments have happened?
Well, I think the major development that's happened since the last time that we spoke has been on the legal aspect of things. I don't know if you remember, but the EU ETS basically came about. The inclusion of aviation in the EU ETS came about as the result of a directive from the EU in 2008, and then member states of the EU have the responsibility of transposing that into national law through 2009 and into 2010. So the UK was the first member state to finish transposing the first part of those regulations, and that came into force last September. And now they're working on transposing the second part of the regulations. Consultation period for that ended at the beginning of March, and it's not yet clear as to exactly when the second part of those regulations is actually going to come into force. It could be this summer, or not quite sure yet. But the interesting thing is that with the first part of the regulations now being part of EU law, we've now seen the first legal challenge to the EU ETS,
right.
Which was filed by the US Air Transport Association and 3 US airlines, American, United and Continental, last December. So that is now in the works. So there's a formal legal challenge to the EU ETS based on the UK's transposition of the directive. So that's basically playing through now. In addition, while we're waiting to see what the legal ramifications of that are, the EU ETS itself is still in place. So last year, operators were supposed to file their monitoring plans to say how they're going to comply, and so this year and next year they're basically supposed to be compliant. They're supposed to be monitoring their data, monitoring their emissions, and then they're going to have to file the first set of reports for 2010 next year. So we're kind of like in a practice phase right now for the next 2 years until actual trading begins in 2012. The last thing would be that the number of operators on the EU ETS list continues to evolve. The first list that came out last February 2009 had something like 2,700 and something operators on it. Now we're up to 4,302 operators in the latest iteration of the list. Most of these operators are very, very small, single tail numbers, so whether or not they actually will qualify to be covered by the EU ETS still needs to be seen, but they're on the list, and so they're going to need to be investigated, basically. So that's kind of where we are right now as far as the development of the EU ETS is concerned.
Okay, and what sort of impact is this going to have on operators? Can you perhaps give us a specific example?
Yeah, well, first of all, there are a number of different cost burdens that operators are going to have to face with the EU ETS. Right now, it's the administrative cost of complying. So it's basically an operator who figures out that they're on the list and they're going to have to comply. They need to go and invest time and resources into finding out what the requirements are, who their regulating agency is, what kind of report they need to file, how their existing IT systems can supply the data, whether they need to buy in new, upgrade their systems, all that kind of administrative stuff. For large airlines, that could mean a team of people working full-time on this for years to develop that. So you're looking at a significant cost burden from an administrative point of view. For a small operator, where the burden is roughly the same, but with much smaller human resources to actually look at the problem, you can see that the cost burden for a small operator is going to be disproportionate. So there's that administrative cost burden. And then once trading actually begins in 2012, you're going to have the actual cost of the carbon allowances themselves. And some of the analysis that we've done seems to indicate that basically the final analysis, when it comes down to it, is how much does it actually add on to the price of a ticket. And we think it probably is in the region of anywhere between 1 to 5% on top of a ticket. Now for a low fare operator, because your base fare is lower, that may actually be higher, but we think it's probably going to be around in that region, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when you consider that generally the profit margin that the airline industry makes, even in good years, is on the order of, is in that region. I mean, like take for example EasyJet last year, their pre-tax profit margin was somewhere less than 2%.
Right.
You know, all of a sudden, it's not an insignificant cost that operators are going to need to face from carbon trading, in addition to the administrative cost of compliance that they're going to have to deal with as well.
Okay, great. We've recently had the UN climate change talks in Copenhagen.
Yep.
Have any particular implications for the airline industry?
Well, the major hope for coming out of Copenhagen was basically that aviation would be included in some sort of global deal.
Right.
The major issue that that airlines have with the EU ETS, and you're seeing this in terms of the legal challenge that's being mounted by some of the US carriers, is that it's a unilateral approach. It's geographically based, and you're trying to account for emissions that are global in nature, because aviation is a global industry, and so the whole thrust and the hope from international aviation bodies such as IATA, their whole hope was that out of Copenhagen we'd have some sort of global, what they call a global sectoral approach to aviation's emissions regulation. Now that hasn't happened in fullness. However, there's been some movement. There seems to be a certain level of greater understanding, at least at the UN level, that aviation as an industry needs to be treated on a global basis. But on the other hand, because it's an international industry and it's an international regulation that you're looking at, it means that there are some serious political hurdles that need to be overcome before we can actually see that.
I can imagine. Can you perhaps elaborate on those hurdles a little bit more, please?
Yeah, well, the major sticking point has to do with the conflict between two fundamental principles that basically come together when you look at global aviation and global emissions regulation. The first one, when you talk about global aviation, international aviation is governed by what they call the Chicago Convention. So certain principles are enshrined. Among them is the principle of equal treatment, regardless of geographic origin, that there's supposed to be a level playing field for all carriers, regardless of geographic origin. That is in direct conflict with the global emissions the Kyoto Protocol, basically the framework where you have this principle of what they call common but differentiated responsibility, or CBDR. What that says is basically that developed, industrialized nations need to take greater responsibility than developing economies. And so when you have these two principles that are ostensibly in direct conflict with each other, it's that political hurdle of trying to get countries who want a level playing field versus countries who want the common but differentiated responsibilities framework to take precedence. How you actually reconcile those two is the major sticking point in terms of a global deal for aviation right now.
Well, how do you see aviation doing this? I mean, there must be some particularly challenging elements to get right.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a couple of things that can be, it's not impossible to reconcile those two. I mean, some of the conversations that I've been having where you look at things like, for example, if you had a level playing field for a global aviation deal, but then when the revenues that are raised in terms of the carbon trading costs and things like that, if they are then plowed disproportionately back into developing nations versus developed nations, then there may be something to be done there. But again, it's a lot of political lobbying and being part of the political debate. And I think that's the major challenge for the aviation industry going forward, is actually being a part of that debate and communicating aviation's needs and aviation's responsibilities to folks who are outside the aviation industry. The aviation industry is very, very good at communicating within IATA and within the industry itself. But to the wider context, there's still a lot of skepticism from at the governmental level, from NGOs, who would look at aviation and say, well, why are you guys special? Why do you need some sort of special dispensation for a slightly different scheme? Why is this? And there's a lot of skepticism that needs to be overcome by the aviation industry. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that you're going to have the EU ETS, regional schemes like the EU ETS, replicated in different regions in the world with slightly different requirements, slightly different regulations, that aviation is going to basically be buried under a patchwork legislation.
Right, okay.
And so if the aviation industry doesn't continue to push and to up its game and to really lobby to be part of the party to the table at the international level, what's going to happen is you're going to have this kind of patchwork legislation. And by engaging with the debate now, at least we have a chance to shape and influence the events as they unfold.
Thank you very much, Gary. We'll leave it there, and it's definitely some interesting times ahead. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.